Hello, everyone. Instead of doing our usual introduction, because we are doing summer shorts, everything is a little shorter, so we can make sure you can get out to the sprinkler on your lawn with your gym shorts on, as the bare naked ladies like to say. I would like to start off by asking Magnus a question. Magnus, can I ask you a question?
Ooh, go ahead.
Yes. So we're starting this summer short series talking about live action Batman because summer shorts would not be short if we talk about animated Batman along with it. What for you is the gayest thing about Batman?
The bat nipples.
Ah, okay. Well, we have to hold on to that because George Clooney has been apologizing for that for many years, even though as an actor he had no control over his costuming. But we'll get to that when we talk about Batman and Robin because I have lots of thoughts about that as a child um, of that era. But the reason I ask that is because
Yes.
Batman pretty much since its inception has been plagued by this idea of Batman being homosexual. This episode is titled Seduction of the Innocent after the book from 1954 by Frederick Wortham. That was the publication that created the Comics Authority Code that people had to get their comic books in like the 40s and 50s. They had to get the stamp of approval for it to go out to be sold. Batman has like a whole chapter in this book. It feels like all about how much Batman is a homosexual. It's why
Mm.
Batgirl was created. It's why in the Batman movie, um, the Batman the movie from 1966, they have a kind of this weird dowager anthelis with them along with Alfred. It's this weird thing of Batman has always, except for like the very early 1930s Batman, which gets referenced very heavily in the '89 film, which we're going to talk about in another
Mm.
episode. Um, there's something about Batman that seems to inspire uh, thoughts about both crime and about homosexuality. So there's something very interesting in Batman to me feels the most heterosexual when people aren't doing fan art of him. But it seems like the world really wants Batman to be queer. In fact, that's we'll talk about George Clooney
Mm.
playing queer Batman, but specifically Seduction of the Innocent seems to be very concerned with a lot of things that are sort of part of Batman canon. And the Batman film from '66 is both very queer and not very queer at all in a lot of ways, interestingly.
Mm. Indeed. It's interesting that you say all that. I do know that they I don't know, accusations isn't the right way to put it. Um, Labeling of Batman in a homosexual manner has plagued the character for many years. Even saying plaguing doesn't sound the right way. Oh, I'm trying to find the right way to sort of balance it out.
I think plaguing is the right word.
Mm,
I do think the fan art overcorrects a little bit beyond what I think would probably happen if Batman were to come out as bisexual or queer. Batman's relationship with Selena Kyle does make him seem like he's probably a sub, and Selena's probably the dom. And there's something
mm,
about the '66 version of Batman for me that actually feels the most. Adam West's version feels the most heterosexual, probably because he was the only one that did the audition and could actually get through the lines without laughing because they were so very serious in an unserious world. But it's part of Batman
mm,
oeuvre that he is very like he can become under the spell of a woman very quickly. Let me tell you what.
mm. It, it it's very interesting that there's almost seems like quite a flip side to Batman from a few different angles. One hand, some portrayals of him across as quite camp and such. Other portrayals, particularly in modern times, have very much focused on the dark and the gritty, the Dark Knight, so to speak. Um, then you've got, as you say, hom- the homosexual-ish esque portrayals versus the heterosexual ones. They've sort of brought Catwoman forward quite a bit. I believe they got married in the comics in recent years. Um,
Yes.
so they've tried to really push her forward as like his actual love interest rather than sort of like on and off again the chase sort of relationship that they've had.
Yeah.
Um, I wonder whether it was sort of having a character that was quite focused on his career, on pursuing justice and truth and such, that he didn't usually have a woman partner in his life. Not like with Superman, Lois Lane being very well established as his partner and such. Batman, it was more, he's so focused on his career that he doesn't sometimes allow himself to really indulge in a family and such. It all factors into the background of the character and his psychology. But I wonder if that was sort of inroads for people to then make their own theories on why Batman is not really concerned with finding a female partner. And maybe that's sort of where that sprang from a bit.
I feel like it can sort of answer this question with some film history and some comics history, just to give people context for Batman. And we're going to see this come up over and over again in these summer shorts. So I want people to kind of hold on to this idea. Batman himself is, even in his creation, sort of a throwback character. He's based on a combination of the Mask of Zorro, that has a very femme flamboyant Scarlet Pimpernel sword fighting feel, but he's also based on these kind of hard boiled lone wolf detective characters from the 1930s from pulp comics. He's very heavily influenced like that, even in this kind of campy era, which lasted until almost the 1980s in a way. Um, the detective angle, this idea that we're going to see in '89's Batman about the Art Deco-ness of Gotham, it's really all kind of a pastiche, kind of an homage to this kind of hard-boiled lone wolf detective, and having this hard-boiled Batman character fall in love with what's essentially a female cat burglar makes sense. What's interesting is that in Batman the film, which actually came out between seasons 1 and 2 of the Batman TV series. It's part of the universe of it. Wasn't like a show ender. It came out in the middle of the series, actually. Um, it doesn't feature Yvonne Craig, who is Batgirl, who is usually thought of as the character answer to get rid of rumors of homosexuality between him and his ward. Um, it's this really interesting thing of, in this camp universe, Batman becomes the most straight figure in response to everything around him, but in the later, grittier universes, he becomes a more queer. I would argue, if anyone is queer, it's the Batman Who Laughs, which I eventually want to do a whole episode on, because I actually think the Batman Who Laughs is an amazing look at a camp gone a completely dark direction. But going back to the '66 film based off of this camp TV show, everything in this TV show and the film is a response to not wanting to do that top boil film noir detective thing, and trying to make Batman more friendly, more lush, to add in that sort of technological sci-fi futurism we see with both his utility belt and with the dehydrator thing they have. So it's an interesting. Batman '66, I think, is still very iconic, because it's an interesting kind of showcase, and we're going to see this over and over again. When Batman breaks a mold, Batman becomes wildly successful, but when Batman follows a trend, it almost always inevitably leads to his near cancellation.
Hmm.
Which is sort of what happens with the Batman TV show. I also, for context, before we continue talking about the film, I want to talk about the other kind of big films we still reference in this time period that were created in '66. So Batman the film, Fantastic Voyage, which is about the people going into the body in a submarine. A funny thing happened on the way to the Forum, which is the film musical version of the Stephen Sondheim show, The Ghost and Mr. Chicken, starring Don Knotts, which is the one where he didn't play the fish, and Elizabeth Taylor and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. So in 66, when Batman the film came out, a lot of what we saw, even in adventure films, in musicals, in horror films, even in this kind of dramatic Virginia Woolf depiction, it's all very heightened and it's almost all very camp. So in 66, Batman actually fit in a lot with the landscape of what people expected from
Hmm.
from their films, essentially.
Hmm. Because it was being 66, it was um wasn't that around the liberation era within the United States and such?
Yeah, but that happened in 69 and it was still considered counterculture for a lot. Like Adam West Batman was the type of Batman where Adam West went to a lot of orgies, but Batman would have probably tutted a lot of orgies. It's one of the things that makes Adam West really work as Batman is that Frank Gorshin as the Riddler and Cesar Romero as the Joker and Burgess Meredith as the Penguin. They are insane. They're having a lot of fun. They have no cares to give. And Adam West as Batman is like doing these Shakespearean monologues, abject of them. One of my favorite stories about Adam West casting is the idea that he goes into this restaurant and he asks, he's dressed as Batman. He goes to this restaurant dressed as Batman and he asks for a table in the back in order to be as discreet as possible while being dressed as a bat. And that's sort of the vibe of both the film and just this portion of Batman ideology in general. This very friendly, paternal dad bat that Adam West really gets in a lot of
Hmm.
ways.
Yes. So he was coming across as quite as a definitely with the paternal side of the Batman characteristic and such, you would say. Um, because how Bruce and Batman are in terms of like their sort of paternal fatherly figureness does fluctuate depending on what variation of Batman we're looking at.
Yeah.
I'm trying to recall that he was very much sort of come, let's go, my ward. We're going on a new cracking adventure, sort of thing in this version.
Yeah, and this is the version most people know of Batman pretty much until the end of the Super Friends run, until the end of Scooby Doo
Mm.
movies. So until 89, and we get the Batman film with Michael Keaton and sort of the reinvention and the not
Mm.
quite origin story of the character, um, this sort of like friendly sweater Batman, almost a clone of Superman in a lot of ways. And the comics followed the formula of the success of this campy TV show. And so you actually see the decline in comic sales because of the decline of the TV show. And you see the
Mm.
rise of Batman in 89 because of the rise of things like the killing joke or the unaliving joke because we live in the age of the internet and you can't say the word kill anymore. Um, but yeah, so this 66 film, I kind of wanted to see if we could, unless you really want to, I kind of
Mm.
wanted to see if we could get away with not talking about the more obvious elements of it being camp, because most people, when they think about this version of Batman, they think about the camp, the absurdity, the over toppedness of it. But there's so much to this version of Batman that yes, it's about that, and it's good to acknowledge that. But
Mm.
I'm wondering what more we can like push about the conversation of what the Batman is. Uh, for
Mm.
instance, his kind of love for Kitka, who is Catwoman's like damsel in distress character in this film, is amazing. He like mourns her when he discovers she's Catwoman, and the end of the film is him like mourning the loss of the love of his life of this woman that just so happened quote unquote to be kidnapped when he was like this is a heterosexual Batman if there were ever a heterosexual Batman. Like all the other heterosexual Batman, like the Darkest Night, the Grim Knight, or whatever it's called now,
Mm.
they all seem like they're drag kings compared to Adam West's effortless morning. Adam West's Batman almost gets married like 3 times throughout the series, and almost always to Catwoman. It is actually a little ridiculous, like beyond the camp aspect of it, of how in love with like this version. Like we're going to talk about Vicky Vale eventually, and we're going to talk about Nicole Kidman at some point because the opening of Nicole Kidman and the brush of Beyonce wind and her like black dress, amazing, iconic, and super queer. But there is something about this version of the Catwoman, Lee Merriweather, Julie Newmar, that Adam West's Batman just absolutely digs. And it's like not even funny how bad he wants to not bone her, but marry her. Because these are
Mm,
like this is like a sexless Batman almost. Which
mm.
is very funny considering Adam West and apparently Frank Gorshin used to go to orgies together, and they would like do character voice while they were at the orgy to the point that people were like asking
I,
them to stop, I guess.
oh
Which I
wow.
think is amazing. Like that's the kind of orgy I need to be signed up for, right?
I did not know that fact. Wow. These days, you'd probably have to pay an actor to put on the voice, and you'd have like a contract and everything to sign, so that whilst they're doing role play, that you purchased from them to do, that they were
Yeah,
just doing it.
you'd have to get the cameo for like $300 to get them to do it in
Oh,
voice.
of course. Oh yeah, and you'd have a set time and everything. Oh wow, I did not know
Yeah.
that. That's fantastic. As you say, this version of Adam West, um, sorry, this version of Adam West, this version of Batman by Adam West, um, it's almost very gentle heterosexual. Like he's clearly pining. It's not mm, like subtle, but in terms of trying to swat away the allegations of the homosexual Batman, that perhaps was a really good way to do it. You know, don't put it in the face like, oh, Batman, you now have to go and prove your heterosexuality by throwing Catwoman into bed and ravaging her, etc. Which, the Bond films did to excess, etc. Um, but instead, you've got here, like, a clear romantic interest in Catwoman. As you say, when I was rereading to brush up my knowledge on this film, it describing what was her name? Mrs. Kittler? Killer?
So the acronym, which again, her name is an acronym. Her acronym name is Kitka. Let me see if I can find the full pronunciation of this name. So here's the full pronunciation of her disguised Soviet journalist name: Kitanya Irina Tatiana Kerneska Alasov, which is Kitka. And I'm like, did Katya Zamlova come out of like the womb from this or something? It's like
No,
hats on hats on hats. Like if anything, it's
mm,
queer. It's Catwoman deciding she needs the longest name ever for her like Soviet
mm.
doppelganger.
Well, it's another example of the gentle absurdity of some of this period and such.
Yeah.
I mean, didn't the Penguin um, recreate the submarine that he and his little gang of crooks were escaping on? Didn't he turn that into a giant penguin as well and
Uh,
everything?
yes,
So-
the penguin mobile, I guess I would call it. But yeah, so the whole plot of this movie is a Scooby Doo episode. There's literally a projector in a buoy in the ocean, and there's like disguise on disguise. They're missing literally everything but a talking dog in this film. Like for some reason, the Penguin hires these three three
Pirates?
lieutenants. Yeah, but he doesn't penguinize them. He has them do this pirate thing. With their names are they're not their own villains. They don't exist in the rogues gallery or anything. They're just these three extra pirate sub villains, I guess, because they're like lieutenants, but they're goons, but they're not. It's and one of them is named Quetch, which is like the worst character name I think I've ever seen. Like they did Bluebeard and Morgan, which sure, and then the third pirate, poor George Sawaya, they name his character Quetch. Like it's not why is a penguin themed villain would you have pirate associates like it's not close enough to like if you want to be culturally insensitive in the 60s, like why aren't they Eskimo Inuit themed? You know, why are they pirates? The movie does take place a lot on the water, but this is like the one issue I have with this movie. Um, I actually really like that it's a submarine theme because I really like that. But like the Bluebeard, Morgan, and Quetch, I find them very distracting in this film, to be honest.
Hmm. Uh, yeah. Sorry, I was just remembering them and such. Oh, memories. Um, so yes, going back to it. If you want to try and combat allegations of homosexuality, I think having such a gentle focus on a love interest like Lady Catalia, whatever it was, is,
Her name's
and
Kit Kat, and she's no lady. She's a cat woman.
but then actually still having it as Catwoman, who you've established with the series to be someone that Batman has almost tied the knot with multiple times and such, it establishes an ongoing thread, and that works well. You know, amongst all the zaniness that's going on with this, this gang of crooks are basically off having a proper escapade together.
Yeah. And this is one of the first times that villains come together. They don't call them the Rogues Gallery, but this is probably one of the first times there's a proper Rogues Gallery like denoted in villains working together. And Batman has had so many different versions of a Rogues Gallery that you can't actually like pinpoint where it exactly starts at. But the four of
Mm,
these together as like pretty much always in some version of the gallery for Batman is actually really nice. Like if you want to think about, because almost all of the Batman films try to recreate the success of the 1960s re re-release reproduction of the 1930s Batman serial. Like most of
mm,
them don't actually care that much about the comics except for 89 Batman, I feel like. I could be wrong about that. Could be misreading it. But this is like it's a really interesting nod to the history of Batman on film as opposed to the history of Batman in comics. Like I said earlier, the comics, well, so the 1940s, 50s Batman that would lead into this 1960s camp Batman is very much closer to Captain America spiritually. After the World War,
mm,
they pulled back on him being like pulp comic detective, and that's where they started crafting this kind of friendlier, vibrant dad Batman.
mm.
That's also where we start to see Dick Grayson come into his own as Robin, which you don't see much in. You see it in some of the films, but not all of them. And yes, we are going to talk about Chris O'Donnell at some point because I have so many thoughts. But there's something interesting about this film where inside of this camp, this is also one of the few times that Bruce Wayne Bruce Wayne as Batman really does heavy commentary on the political situation. You don't see that a
Mm,
lot, but this movie is heavily invested in the fact that this disguise the Catwoman wears is a Soviet reporter, the
mm,
USSR, the fact that it's the dehydrator is like going after the UN Security Council specifically, the fact that it's about international relations and how Batman's big moral is about people needing to learn to get along. This is very it's almost a hyper political Batman that we're not going to see again, and that people now write fan fiction about a Batman version of this. We have this Batman though. 1966 Adam West Batman is the best dad bat. Like if you put the Signal in here or something, I bet the great things would have happened for the Signal instead of being tortured by the Batman who laughs. This is a really hyper aware, really kind of great, really definitely. This is the Bruce Wayne that probably raised a lot of money for
mm,
like the charities of Gotham, and like every now and then would ask his friend, quote unquote, Batman to do guest appearances, raising money. I'm
mm,
guessing if you want a Batman that like is super involved in Gotham and like curing its woes without it being like magically
mm,
festering swampland, this is the Batman you want. Is this Adam
mm.
West Bat?
And he's the sort that would have been you know, introducing his adopted sons or sons if he'd brought on more of his of the Robins and such. Probably even a spot. I think he might have done it in the comics, sponsoring Gotham's orphanage and such. Um, this is the Bat. I would suppose you could say this is the Batman who shows he really cares about the political situation beyond Gotham. Now, Batman's been traditionally, leading member of the Justice League, and they're concerned with protecting the Earth, etc. But this Batman was quite involved in actually a sort of moral rightness, trying to combat society's woes, not just going around and beating up random thugs and
Yeah.
such.
And that,
um,
yeah, that goes back to that seduction of the innocent. It feels like it's trying to answer for the Comics Code Authority. It feels like it's trying to answer the things in this book, accusing Batman of basically the seduction of the innocent book is like the 1940s
mm,
version of why boys shouldn't play video games, because if they play Call of Duty, they'll like start taking up weapons to do whatever. Like the book is basically that. It's like the fear mongering of Batman is homosexual and will cause your kids to do crime. So don't buy Batman comics. And then their response to that was not to like discuss why the pulp genre works and why it doesn't make people commit crime. Their response was to like datify Batman essentially and to turn Gotham into this like very colorful world where when Cesar Romero doesn't feel like shaving, so his Joker just has a mustache under white face paint, no one bats an eye. Like that's what I love about this Joker specifically is that Cesar Romero was like, I'm not shaving this mustache. That's too bad. You just have to deal with it, you know? It's fabulous.
and where the villains jump in a getaway car and scream, "Ah, you beat me again, Batman! But I'll be back next week." And Batman probably just give them a friendly wave and go,
Yeah.
"Yes, you do that."
Well,
It,
yeah.
this is
Oh,
on.
yeah, so that's one interesting thing is that the idea of cliffhangers were very
Mm,
prevalent in the 60s. And so people that came to watch the Batman movie were probably expecting the getaway and expecting because the Batman TV show for the first couple of years, it would be on twice a week. And the first part in the week, it would be like, this is the first part of the cliffhanger. And then the second part, so it was almost serialized in the way of the 1930s film reel. And so people actually expected the part one, part two. They expected these very like static. This is when we're in Act One. This is when we're in Act Two. Like they expected what they got, and they really liked that. And I find that very comforting myself. If I'm honest,
mm.
you know.
I was going to say that we were talking about this being perhaps the most um, dad-esque Batman and such. And I want to make a connection by what you were saying before with Batman being quite socially conscious in this iteration, about being quite concerned with Gotham, etc. You could almost argue that that is another side to the whole paternal instinct, someone that's reaching out and not just concerned with his home life, but trying to be almost like a good father figure for the rest of the city and such as well. I'm not talking Mafia Don. No, no,
Yeah,
that's
that's
more.
much later.
Yeah.
That's very much later in universe. But yeah, but even
Mm,
like having Alfred still be here because shortly after the 60s, Alfred dies or goes away anyways. But Aunt Harriet sticks around, so like he's never left alone with his ward really.
mm,
But there's this interesting thing is that when Batman loses his way as a paternal figure, Alfred always comes back. It's part of his like arc in both Owlman and in the Batman Who Laughs is the influence of Alfred as stepdad in a lot of ways. And we're going to see
mm,
that in future Batman projects. But here, Alfred is here, and Bat Dad is fully realized in this crazy,
mm,
colorful which is really cool. So,
mm. in- Indeed. And what would you say of Robin and his performance in this film?
um, I mean, everyone kind of knows that this version of Dick Grayson's version of Robin is this golly gee Willikers Robin who's a little too pure for this world. and they really don't ever talk about the fact that he's an orphan. Like, I feel like there's a reason we don't get future Robins for a while after Dick Grayson, because it's the only Robin we got after Dick Grayson for a while was the Robin that fans disliked so much they decided he was going to get beaten to death by the Joker in a very famous like call this number to save Robin and not enough people called sort of thing. So like
Mm,
I don't know. I like Dick Grayson more as Nightwing. I think he actually works more on his own. It's quite a bit like the Riddler is a better villain in Central City against Green Arrow than he is against Batman because he's too close to the Joker. I feel like Dick
mm,
Grayson lives in that shadow. But I think Burt Ward did a great job. I mean, he has sort of this like not quite damsel in distress thing going on that Batman needs, especially because Yvonne Craig is so fabulously queer coded and so like fabulously realized. Yvonne
mm.
Craig is the queerest thing for me in the Batman series, and I'm kind of sad that they didn't do any of the like. I don't think she's in any of the follow up films to the Batman 66 series, and that makes me sad because Yvonne Craig was the gayest thing about this. Um, but yeah, I like Burt Ward as Dick Grayson as Robin. He's fine, but I mostly think Robin is just fine. He's better than Marvin from the Super Friends. I found Marvin very cloying unnecessarily. So yeah.
Mm, indeed. I- Well, I'm trying to think of another point, sir. Did you have some other points you wanted to bring along before we
Um,
go to conclusions?
Yeah, I have more about Batman as a whole. I just didn't want
Hmm.
to spend the entire half an hour talking about how it's camp and over the top because anyone that's seen 5 minutes of this know that it is. The idea that Batman has to hold a cartoonishly long bomb while skipping along up here is like an obvious thing. I will say the names of these characters: Commodore Schmidlap, who doesn't know he's been kidnapped; Vice Admiral Fangsleister, which is just fun to say. There's an uncredited voice of President Lyndon B. Johnson for some reason.
Oh,
There's
okay.
just there's something very fun about this version of Batman, but having him be Bat Dad and being politically aware, we'll see some iterations of this in future Batman,
Mm,
but in the 60s, this kind of corrective nature of trying to keep Batman from ever being grim is both going to work in favor and also be totally deconstructed over. By the time
mm,
we get to
mm,
1980s Batman, they're really setting it back into the shadow of things. But we'll talk a little more of that in
mm,
Batman 89, which I think will have some interesting revelations.
mm.
So that's my final thought.
I do wonder whether, like, well, to be honest, the whole thing with the 80s, 90s, going into like the more, I was always about to say down to earth, but it wasn't really that. It was more, it was a counter reaction to earlier decades trying to make properties more quote unquote realistic by bringing them back down a little bit. I think then when you went into the 90s to early 2000s, it up a bit for a number of properties. It kind of went back to the more cartoony, out there style, especially as anime started to become quite popular in the West, and you got sort of like over the top action. And then it took a turn again in 2010s, early 2000s, and everything started to go quite grim and dark again, culminating within Dawn of Justice, the movie, and and just how grim that was. Um, but yeah, I wonder whether this was just like what we're gonna see was a counteraction to how sort of like, dare I say, fun 1966 Batman was.
Yeah. And that fun was almost all tongue in cheek. Like it was done
Mm,
thoughtfully. And that's the important thing to remember is that when you watch that 60s Batman, that was done in response to something. Everything done with camp that's done well is done not just in response, but it's very much like Batman is done by John Waters specifically to neuter the idea of this lone wolf kind of pot bellied detective character. Like I love the
mm,
idea of this. Bat. That's it. Actually, the Batman 66 levels on one of the Lego Batman video games is one of my favorites because you really do get the vibe and like it works really well for a Lego set, especially.
Mm.
And it's exciting, and that's one of the things I'm excited to talk about in later Batman because later Batman knew how to merchandise the hell out of their product. And this is the one Batman part of the Bat franchise that we don't get nearly enough merch for, especially Yvonne Craig stuff, in my opinion.
That might well change if, say, Lego continues to like search for new stuff to turn into sets. You might well get a 1966 era Batman set.
We'll very much see. Yeah, but it's time for our shorts to close, for our shorts to go into another pool, and we'll be back with more. Unless you have anything to kind of round out the episode with, we can head on
Mm.
to a new Batman feature shortly.
No, I think it's time to swish our capes and fly off into the night, good sir.
And I will say, finishing this episode, bam, pow, and